Hello, Pastor Matthew Diehl here again. Great you could join us here in Round Top Church Christian Fellowship in Round Top, Texas. I always say the center of the known universe. And this morning we have Reverend, a lot of titles, Stephen Atkinson. He's actually a Christian witness to Israel. He's their director out of Arkansas. And but his roots are in Ireland. And I always get it mixed up. I want to say Bangor, Ireland, but it's probably not Bangor.
It's Bangor, it is, but it's Northern Ireland.
Okay.
There's a world of difference, and that's a whole different country, Ireland. So Northern Ireland, get
Well,
it right.
excuse me. And then earlier you said you were Scotch-Irish.
Yeah, because, again, without going into the politics too much, but in Northern Ireland there are two communities, as nearly in every world. The two communities are the Celtic Irish and the Scots Irish. And so even that, I suppose, you could trace some of the origins of all the tensions that there were in Northern, and still are, even today. I noticed that there's been some trouble in Belfast over the weekend. And so Northern Ireland, sadly, is it's my home place of birth, but yeah, there are problems between communities, and it's the same everywhere in the world. I remember thinking way back, I remember seeing way back, whenever the troubles were really bad in Northern Ireland, and someone came up with a little gospel tract and said, "It takes a Jew to solve the Irish problem."
Okay,
And,
Jesus.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So your problems, my problems, our country's problems,
Yeah.
it takes that Jewish guy called Jesus
Yeah.
to solve the problem.
You know, today we've asked Stephen to come. It's Resurrection Day, as I call it. I realize the rest of the world, or a lot of it, calls it Easter. But Stephen delivered the message today, and he brought up a good point. I thought, I'm a historian, but I don't know everything, obviously. We all like to look at ourselves, pretty good historians. But you brought a story in about Jews coming up the Hudson and founding New York, and I'd not heard that. It's part of the
Yeah,
history that I've missed.
it's a fascinating story, and it's only something that I've grown to understand in actually coming to live here. I moved over here from Northern Ireland, as you know, almost 9 years ago. And very often, I've been a regular pastor for half my ministry life, for like about 18 years. I've been working with Christian Witness to Israel for 17 years, so that's my 35 years of preaching. But often when I go into a new ministry or a new location, whether it be in Ireland or I served 5 years in England as well, I like to get the background to the location. So for example, the Lord has a sense of humor because I'm a townie from Bangor. It's kind of a dormitory town to Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland. But my first pastoral charge was in a little country church 80 miles west of Belfast. And I knew nothing about country life or, cows and sheep and whatever.
That's what we got here.
Yeah, well, I knew nothing about this, but the Lord puts me out there. So what did I do? One of the first things that I did was I spent a day on the farm of one of my elders. And no, you can't learn everything in a day, but it was important for me to learn the seasons, or to learn when they do this, why they do this, so that I could then minister to them. Putting that all into the nutshell then of Christian Witness to Israel, I wanted to learn a lot about the theological reason why we should have a witness to the Jewish people. And then particularly when I moved over here, as I say 9 years ago, I started to think, well, where did the Jewish people come from? Why are they here? Why is 42% of the world's Jewish population living in the United States of America?
Now, is that more than are in Israel?
It used to be more, but it's actually Israel has overtaken.
How
Within
much
really
so?
by the past 5, 6, 10 years maybe, Israel has 45%.
Of the Jewish
Of the whole world.
Okay.
Yeah, so 42 here, 45% in Israel. That means almost 90% of the world's Jewish population is living in Israel and the United States.
What a relationship.
And so I, coming here, felt, okay, well, why is this? And how did this come about? Because first of all, I know biblically the imperative, the mandate we have to bring the gospel back to those who brought it to us. As I always say, the book is Jewish, the man is Jewish, the message is Jewish. They brought it to us. It was Jewish missionaries who told the world about their Jewish guy Jesus. Now, so Gentile church, what do we do? How do we bring it back? And particularly so as we have 42%, 6 million or so Jewish people here on our shores. That is no accident. And so that got me starting to read. And I honestly admit, I never knew this until I moved over here and started to get a few books on the history of Jewish people in America. And it was really interesting to me that the beginnings of the Jewish community started way back in, I suppose, the days of Columbus. I didn't share that in the story really in the sermon today, but...
Are you saying Columbus was a Jew?
You know, there is some scientific evidence to suggest he was. He certainly had Jewish people on his ships.
Yeah.
They spoke Hebrew because he thought he was going to find the lost tribes in the New World. Was he Jewish? Some of the evidence would suggest that we don't know when he was born.
But he did sign his name, the cross bearer. Remember his signature?
Well, you see, at that time, there were conversos. In other words, there were Jewish people that converted in name, but secretly within they retained their Jewishness. Okay. In Spain at that time, they were getting kicked out of all, and so they had three options: convert, leave, or die. That was their options. Now,
in the late 1400s.
It was the late 1400s. 1492, the Edict of Expulsion. King Ferdinand kicks them all out of Europe, but at the same time, Columbus starts his journey. Same year, 1492. 1492. Young people, historians, scholars, whatever, 1492 changed the world. But 1492, they were kicked out of Europe. And again, compressing the history, but there was a Jewish community started in the New World in Brazil. Now at that time, in the early 1500s, the community in Brazil was cared for by the Dutch. Again, Dutch trade. Holland was reformed. Again, the Reformation was happening at that time.
Reformed Church.
The Reformed Church.
Like Calvinism.
Well, the Dutch were probably Calvinists, so the Dutch were of that Reformed ilk. It was Reformed theology as opposed to Catholic theology. Yeah, right. Catholic theology was really the replacement theology that suggested that they had replaced Israel. In other words, this whole new priestcraft, we don't need Israel anymore. God is done with Israel. But it was the Reformed Church, and actually it was, Luther gets bad press on it, but Luther actually began by trying to win the Jewish people. Where did that come from? Why was he interested in the Jews? Well, go check your history, but Luther first started to try and win the Jewish people. Calvin never really had much contact with Jewish people, although his sermons and his commentaries were much warmer. But you take the Reformation, which is a gradual thing that moves from Germany to Switzerland to Holland to Great Britain.
Now in Brazil with these Dutch.
But now it's coming to Brazil because it's the Dutch. Yes, the Dutch influence, and what that means, particularly not only for the state of the country, it means good biblical theology is returning, but it also means the Jewish people are being cared for. Why did they care for the Jewish people? Well, they believed that they had an obligation. They are loved on account of the forefathers, says Romans 11:28. So it is right for the church to love Israel. It is right for the church to have a warm-heartedness towards the Jewish people, and ultimately a heartedness that wants their salvation. My heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved, Romans 10:1. So you find them being cared for in Recife, Brazil. The first synagogue in the New World was built in Recife, Brazil. But fast forward then into the 1600s, and Brazil is in the care of the Dutch, except at that time the Portuguese revolt, and Recife and Brazil gets taken over by the Portuguese.
So from what's the time frame here? The Jews first showed up there in Brazil until there was the Portuguese takeover.
Well, mid-1500s, you have that.
So within 60, 70 years.
So in that sense, you have the changes taking place in Europe are starting to take place in the New World. Okay. And we can think even also of the Pilgrim Fathers up in the northern parts as well. Yeah. So think of all this in the plan of God, in the purposes of God. None of this happens by chance. This is God weaving the web of time. And so things are happening in Europe, things are happening in the New World, south, in the southern Americas, and now also in the North Americas. But the Jewish people in 1654 face another crisis. In 1654, Portugal takes over Brazil. And so now today we have everyone in Brazil speaking Portuguese. So when Portugal takes over Brazil, the Jewish people are getting kicked out again. Just as it was in the old world, so now in the new world, they're getting kicked out. And what happens is there was a 1,500 community, a community of 1,500 in Recife at that time. They're all sent back, and they all make their way back to Amsterdam, except for one ship. And this one ship comes along its journey, and it gets pirated in the Spanish islands.
Yeah.
Spanish islands, Catholic, they take over the ship. And they say, no, you're not going anywhere, we're holding this ship. Until Dutch money says, let my people go. And it's just fascinating to see the pressure that was put on.
So this ship was Jews on board the ship?
This ship had 23 Jews on board. Okay. It was called the St. Catherine. It had been pirated, but then with the Dutch pressure, it was let go again. But because, again, it had suffered some damage, it didn't head to Amsterdam, it limped up the coastline to New Amsterdam, which is the Hudson River, which 10 years later becomes New York. And so the 23 Jewish souls that came out of Recife, Brazil, come into harbour in New Amsterdam in 1654, and you have the first Jewish community in these North American shores. And the 23 go down to 4 for various and even some anti-Semitic reasons. Because again, in those colonies, some of the colonies were Catholic, so some of them were Anglican, Episcopal, and some of them were more Puritan and Reformed. And again, my understanding of the history is that the greater, more biblical the colonies were, the more reformed the colonies were theologically, the more Puritan, we might even say, the colonies were, the better treatment of the Jewish people. It was the Episcopals and the Catholics who continued to give them a hard time. And so what happened, you see them leaving New York area, and they were starting to move down to the southern states. And in the 1600s and early 1700s, you have a very fast-growing Jewish community in the southern states, particularly the Sephardic Jews. In other words, the southern European Jews. Fast forward that again another 100 or so years into the 1700s, the 1800s, and then you have the Germanic Jewish wave. And then you have the Ashkenazis and the Eastern Europeans and the Fiddler on the Roof and all that kind of thing. The huddled masses. And indeed, if you look at, you know, the Statue of Liberty and the poem at the base. The what's her?
Ellis Island.
Ellis Island, yeah. But do you know the poem on the base of that? Can you recite me that poem?
No, I can't.
Bring me your poor, your huddled masses,
okay,
teeming to this shore.
I've never been there.
Well, the story behind that is fascinating also. That poem was written by a Sephardic Jewess, and so the teeming masses that she's thinking about are the Jewish people, okay, all coming to these shores. And so they were coming, there were the rich Jewish people in the southern states in the 1700s, but then in the 1800s and early 1900s you have much more of the poor, the ones that are coming from Eastern Europe without very much in hand. But it's just fascinating to see God's ordering of that. And that, it's simply, my interest in that is not only to say, well, you know, how did that all come about? Well, God ordered it. And now I've got to ask the question, well, why? Why are they here? You know, is it just so that they'll be looked after by evangelical America? Is that our calling? I don't think so. I think God has other plans.
He wants us to witness to that.
Absolutely.
You know, I don't know how many times in your sermon today you said it's the Jewish Messiah.
Yeah.
You know, and
we sometimes forget that. I just
Yeah.
think we sometimes forget that it's a Jewish gospel.
Yeah.
And therefore, if someone does something for you, you feel a sense of debt. You know, I've spoken to that 96-year-old atheist that I was referencing.
Yeah.
I had a conversation like this with him. And I simply said to him, you know, I know you don't believe all this stuff, you're an atheist. I said, but I just want to thank you because your ancestors blessed me with the Jewish Messiah. My Bible says that salvation is of the Jews. And my family, my life, my family's life, my children, my grandchildren, my world is totally changed because of your ancestors. And on their behalf, I want to thank you for that. It was a kind of touchy moment. But the point that I want to raise is I think Gentiles should recognize that we owe a debt to Jewish people, because under God, they blessed us. Now, of course, it's the Messiah that's blessed us. Of course, it's Jesus that's blessed us. But under God, it was the Jewish people that brought us the Messiah. Now, Matthew, you know my story. My story here goes back far. But there's one family, and I stayed overnight with them, and you know them.
Yeah.
That, and again, a providence of God, 21 years ago, that we met in Lexington, Virginia, and we met on several occasions throughout that week when we were holidaying from Northern Ireland in Virginia. And we met this family from Round Top, Texas. And again, long story short, they invited us to come visit. It was a God thing that we met them. They invited us to come visit. My daughter then got to see Texas A&M. She fell in love with Texas A&M. And this family, and indeed folks from this church, blessed us by raising a little fund for my Irish daughter to go to Texas A&M. And we couldn't afford that. That was 2/3 my annual salary were the costs of Texas A&M. I couldn't, because as an international you got to pay big fees. But this church and Nick and Eufanel had decided that because we had met by divine providence, that they would try and make this happen. And so they sought to raise a little package and just say, we met in this way, this is a God thing, and this little Irish girl, would you like to help her come to Texas A&M? And again, you know the story, it was folks from your congregation that helped to make it happen. And it wasn't just one person writing a big fat check, it was, you know, folks giving $50, $100, several $100. And over the 4 years, I just saw the Lord's hand in this church and in the Goads, helping my daughter come to Texas A&M and graduate. Am I grateful? You bet I am.
Yeah.
And do I feel a debt to you guys? You bet.
Well, you know, this is a testimony that God knows us. I said this today. I say it often. He knows us by name. He's personally involved with our lives. We're just not the masses out here. It's a personal
Absolutely.
God. And a testimony like this shows that, you know, God interacts with our lives. He's not a static God that just created the universe, wound the clock, and lets
Amen.
it go. Even though we could have a great theological discussion about, you know, like those who may differ, but we know because of testimonies like this, God is involved in our lives. And those of us who recognize the Spirit of God and avail ourselves, humble ourselves to God's Spirit, things do happen in our lives.
Yeah.
You know, and the big one you touched on today, you know, we're all leaving here. And resurrection, what is that about? Well, as Paul so articulately lays out there, Christ is resurrected to show us that we too will be resurrected to a new life.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, the message of around the world.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen, I appreciate your study, and God has prepared you years before you were ever a Christian witness to Israel, and to bring your family here and involved with this culture. And now you're here. You're in Arkansas.
I live in Arkansas.
Is it near Fayetteville?
It's 20 miles from Fayetteville.
Okay,
Yeah, 20 miles.
and all this providential things in your life, and you're not the only one, but you're one of those ministers who've come here. God had all this preparatory work, and I know it was a few years before you actually got involved with Christian Witness to Israel. And here in America, as you've laid out, 42% of Jews are here in America. I mean, that's just, you know, how God works, you know?
Yeah. And I think what the point that I was trying to make too was that if we Gentile churches, this is really my burden as I try and preach around churches, we Gentiles should have this sense of burden and debt to be repaid. Just as I was emailing you, what was it, January, February, saying, hey brother, it's my time to come down again, and can we schedule for, you know, January, February? And then you said, no, well, can you come Easter Sunday? And I basically said, I'll be there in a heartbeat, brother, you know. And it's what, 600 miles or something, whatever. I'm there in a heartbeat, because that sense of debt to to you, to my friends in Round Top, Texas, because of everything that you guys have done to change my life, but how much more in the spiritual realm that the Jewish people under God were used to change my spiritual life, to tell me about their Jewish Messiah. And so I really feel that churches, again, particularly on Resurrection Sunday, should think of what is the gospel, where did it come from, and why are so many Jewish people today atheists? They don't know this. They think they're just, when they're done, they're done. We have a message from them that tells us, even as old Job said, in my flesh I shall see God. And so the resurrection hope was there for Job. The resurrection hope was there for the psalmist. The resurrection hope was there for all the prophets. And so when the prophet came, Jesus himself, and he lived and he died and he was raised, and the Jewish guys then all spoke about him. And I just think, the only thing that I would say is sometimes I think the Gentile church has hijacked this, and we have taken it all to ourselves.
Well, you know, we have a problem in this country. And, you know, capitalism is a good thing, but capitalism and this culture of me first, and you know the whole thing here in the West, that has invaded the church and kind of lost focus on some things. And what's so good about what the ministry God's called you to, it brings the focus back to, you know, like you use the term the Jewish Messiah. And the church today, you know, you can turn your TV on, and whether it's the health or wealth gospel or whatever is out there, it's too self-centered. You know, and the reality is God wants us to focus on Him and His chosen people that He chose to deliver this message through. You know, and I think that's real important for us.
I think it's important too to know that our mission to them is to bring the gospel. I think one of my concerns that I have as I meet with my American buddies is that we are fascinated by Israel and we have a love for Israel, and that's right and good, but the direction in which we place that love or that interest or that fascination, maybe in eschatology, maybe in Middle East politics, maybe in a ton of other things, but we may miss the one thing that really matters, and that's the gospel. And that's why even today, on this day, I was pressing the point that we must bring the gospel to the lost world.
And you went to 1 Corinthians 15, written by a Pharisee of Pharisees,
exactly,
a Jewish Paul, okay, and he explained to his own Jewish brethren the gospel, and he lays it out there.
Because he's a lawyer.
Yeah, he's a lawyer, yeah. And I thought that was great. You know, you kept connecting the dots. Jewish Messiah, went to Paul, the Pharisee of Pharisees. Here's the gospel. He's preaching to his own people as much as anybody else in the world.
And then it has come to us as well. Wow. You know, it's come to us, Gentile, unclean. As I often say, that when he had this, when the people of Israel had the message of the one true and living God, what were my Scots-Irish ancestors doing? You know, they were dancing round stone in the Highlands of Scotland, worshipping idols, but they had the revelation of the true and living God. But through their missionary activity, they took it across the shores, so that ultimately, 2,000 years ago, we'll be sitting in Round Top, Texas. So that stuns me and humbles me, that they were deliberate enough and intentional enough, and the Jewish lawyer guy and a Jewish fisherman and many others wanted to tell the world about their Messiah. And now here we are with this message. And I just think I think there's ingratitude in us if we're saying, well, thank you very much, Jewish people, let me get on and tell Africa about the Jesus guy. I honestly, I think sometimes we've got on and obsessed with the rest of the world and missions to the rest of the world, and we've forgotten where it all began. And so to me, it's let's get back, restore to the radar that initial mission to Jewish.
Well, Stephen, I thank you today coming and preaching. And, you know, we supported, for our audience to know that we supported Christian Witness to Israel on a monthly basis for a number of years now.
Oh,
and
beyond the 10 years. I think you're probably 12 or 13 years.
Yeah, and so you're the director of the effort here in America. And to have a relationship with churches and try to raise support like we do to help work through the ministry that you're assigned to get the word out.
Yeah, it's raising support, but also raising the whole awareness. And I think this is why, a little bit of history and preaching. I've been a preacher for 35 years. One of the things that COVID, one of the things it forced me to do was to sit at my desk for maybe longer than I want, because I love being out on the road. I love meeting the Lord's people all over the country. But through the desk time, it forced me to really coordinate some of the work that we had been preparing. Way back in 2013, my board asked me to produce a course that would help the Christian church reach its Jewish neighbors. So Jewish people are all around us. How do we reach our Jewish neighbors? So way back in 2013, we produced a little 4-seminar, we called it Connecting with the Cohens. How do we reach our Jewish neighbor? Now over the COVID period, I pulled that together, gave it an upgrade, and from the 4 I now have 20.
Wow.
And some of these are lectures that I've given in seminaries, some of them are sermons, and some of them are just contemporary wisdom pertaining to how we reach our Jewish neighbors, what words we use, what words we don't use, what kind of approach do we take with Jewish people. And so this Connecting with the Cohens has morphed into what I've called the AC course. And since I've got it here, I'm just going to wave it at the camera if I can find it. Oh, have I got it? I should have it here. I think I'm going to... Nah.
I got you on the camera
it's
now,
there.
putting you on the spot.
There we are. There we are. That's the AC course. And if
hold,
you're...
hold a little closer
well,
now.
I can drop it up to there. But if you're interested, go to our website and CWINA, CWI North America, CWINA.org. And you'll find on the resources page some aspects of this. And it really arose in my heart because almost 100 years ago, Frank Exley was the General Secretary of this international mission in London, and he wrote this. And he wrote this actually on the 100th anniversary of the mission. It began in 1842. He was writing in 1942. And he said, "With hearts aflame with love for Israel, and longing that those into whose midst Christ was born should come to know him as their Savior, the founders of our society felt that a twofold task was committed to them. Their first and greatest concern was to present Christ to the Jewish people. But their second was to awaken the conscience of the Christian church." And that's really where I've felt our work falls into those two categories. So I have my colleague Mitch Tepper, who's a Jewish believer, on the streets of Pittsburgh. He's in street corner evangelism, and I was with him a couple of weeks ago, and yes, I drove all the way up to Pittsburgh as well. But I was on the streets of Pittsburgh, in Squirrel Hill, Pittsburgh, where the Jewish community is. So he's frontline evangelism there. He's interacting with his Jewish friends, he's interacting with his Jewish family. And then the other aspect, as I've said, is the church work. Because I feel that the church has a warm heart towards Israel, but it doesn't necessarily know how to do it. And so if we can help in some way to both awaken the conscience and provide the materials and the help and the wisdom, if we've got any, to how to evangelize your Jewish neighbors. And I think, as I said in the service, the Jewish community is all over the U.S., but there are pockets of very strong Jewish communities. And so next month, God willing, I'll be preaching in Boca Raton. And, this is Jewish South Florida. Jewish South Florida. And so, yeah, it'll be, some ministries are tough. But to preach there in a church and stir that church to local Jewish mission.
So you're going to a Christian church in a heavily Jewish
populated area. And they've been asking really for help. How do we reach the Jewish people around us? So that's exciting for me to see that develop. And so that's kind of my task. I want to raise up seminarians. I want to speak in seminaries and help young pastors think about this subject. I want churches that are in Jewish areas to think about how they can be intentional about reaching their Jewish neighbors. And I want to help everyone. You've got a Jewish dentist, you've got a Jewish lawyer, you've got a Jewish doctor, all over the country people have Jewish contacts. And they're coming and they're saying, well, how do I raise the question? What does a Jewish atheist believe? What does a Jewish Orthodox believe? And so I think there's a crying need for us in some way to get alongside churches and help the church be the church. Yeah. In Jewish areas particularly, because they have the mission field right on their doorstep. And then if a church is not in a Jewish, how many Jewish people are in Round Top, Texas? I don't know. Yeah. But if you're not, then I want you to do exactly what you've been doing. Pray for us. Yeah. And support us.
We can support you. We obviously don't have that many here.
Yeah.
I don't know. You know, I mean, but in a population like this, people a lot of times don't declare who they are and what they're about. They just stay to themselves. Mm-hmm. Well, Stephen, I appreciate your time and explaining all this to us. You know, we can study and know the things that we know. Who was it said, you're only as smart as what you don't know, something like that?
Oh, the older I get, the less I know.
Yeah, and that one too, yeah. So, but great for sharing with us the history here of the Hebrew people in America and God's providence from hundreds of years ago to just go around the world, especially through His people, and that we have a responsibility to not only the Jews but to the whole world. But your ministry is to the Jews, and that reflects upon God's calling in your life. We thank you for that. Thank you for coming today. You know, the world's a big place, and here's Stephen's originally from Ireland, and now in a little town of Round Top, Texas. Will be in Florida here soon. Been to Pittsburgh, goes all over, but that's how God works. His word goes through individuals. God chose to do that, to work through people specifically, to spread His gospel message as detailed today. And Stephen read Paul's letter to the Corinthians in chapter 15, what the gospel message is, summing it up, and I encourage you all to read that. So thanks for joining us here, and till next time, God bless each and every one of you. Amen.